Bard on the Plains podcast with Mike McPeak. It's about stories, mine and yours.
Where you live will shape you as a person. In this small community that I grew up in, we had our differences. We had Democrats and Republicans, we had Catholics and Protestants, but basically we were all still kind of the same, just variations of a different theme. So the only exposure I got to people who didn't look like me was through television. It was a time of equal rights protests and civil rights riots, and an angry person was always good to put on the news. Even then I knew that the news didn't show the whole picture, but just a little bit of it. But I still didn't know what to expect when I met somebody that was different than me. Then my senior year of high school, I went down to Kansas City for the National FFA Convention. And while I'm standing there, this black kid comes up to me and starts talking. I was a little nervous. I didn't know what to expect. But, once he started talking to me, I realized that except for the amount of pigmentation in our skins, we really weren't that much different than each other. He was from, I think, Arkansas, and I was from South Dakota. And, we talked about things. We had things in common, and we had things that was different. But, overall, we were all basically the same. And as you listen to this podcast, you'll hear how my mom taught me lessons about learning to respect people who are different than we are. And that's what this podcast is about today, living with people that are different than we are, as I talk to Scott Willsey about being a gaijin in Japan. Today I'm talking to Scott Willsey. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, Mike. I'm a podcaster like yourself. I have pocket-sized podcast, and I have another one called Not Speeding in Reverse that I do with my friend Peter. And more related to, I guess, the topic of today's show, which you'll get into, but I've done other podcasts in the past. I did one with my dad, 6 years ago now, 6 years ago, I guess, and that one was called Audio Gaijin. And basically, I sat down with my dad, who has a better memory than me, and we talked about our time in Japan when I lived there when I was a kid, and of course he was my dad, grown up, and we had a total of 8 years in Japan, so we kind of did a podcast about some of the stories related to that, and it ran its course, and I ended it. And that one's probably one of the most fun podcasts I've ever done.
Okay, yeah. The reason we're talking today is Scott and I was talking on Twitter, and he said something about if you ever need tales about a boy living as a gaijin in Japan for 8 years, let me know. And I, thanks to the power of Google, I went and looked up to see what it is, and basically it means a foreigner living in there. Now, I guess the first question I'm wondering about, how is it that you came to live in Japan in the first place?
Okay, well, the reason why we went there was my parents were missionaries to Japan, and actually, what my dad did is he taught in a Bible school, and they were teaching Japanese pastors in effect. So teaching them the Bible, teaching them how to lead a church, how to grow a church, how to develop a church from nothing, and so that's the reason why we went over there.
Okay, so then you were immersed in the Japanese culture, then, not like maybe somebody living on a naval or air force base where you would still be living, in a Western civilization. So you were actually living in the Japanese culture.
Right. We were always the strange gaijin on the block that people would marvel at and stare at in wonderment as they went by.
So how old were you when you first went to Japan?
When we first went, let's see, I believe I was 7 or 8. Let me do the math here. I would have been about 8 years old.
Okay, so you were old enough to have experienced Western civilization, and then so when you went over to Japan, you could see that there was a difference between what you had experienced before and what you were experiencing now then.
I could see the difference the minute we got off the plane, and I have to tell you, culture shock, it's real. It happened to me, and it changed me profoundly. Before we went to Japan, I was the most confident kid. My parents could leave me anywhere, and I wouldn't worry for a minute. They could be gone for hours, and nothing fazed me. There was not a thing. People would say you could drop a bomb on that kid, and he would not care. And going to Japan opened my eyes to the fact that I was different. This place was different. and everything had changed massively.
So yeah, you were basically you ended up being a stranger in a strange land. Then to use a book title for a phrase here, but so you had to learn a whole new set of customs then.
Yeah, Japan is definitely custom oriented, as people I'm sure know. There's a lot of customs. There's a lot of social, what's the word I'm looking for? Nuances. It's a place where you really have to observe what's going on to understand what's going on, and it's very easy to do the wrong thing and be offensive unintentionally. Well, it's different throughout the range of ages. So your role and your expected behavior changes. When you're a kid, you're one way. When you're in junior high, you're another way. When you're in high school, you're another way. When you're in college, you're another way. When you're an adult in the business world, you're another way. And so it's not as easy as just kind of, okay, blending into the culture. You have to observe the whole gamut of ages and try to understand how you're supposed to relate to these people given your own situation.
Yeah, because I think most of us think of the Japanese culture as a very structured culture. In this country, you can kind of it sometimes it's kind of like hey ho, go with the flow, do whatever you want. But Japanese is more structured and classed, isn't it?
Yeah, I have the feeling. I haven't been there in a long time, but my impression is that it's really changing a lot. Now, when I say really changing a lot, if you compare it to the United States of America, you would still find it that way. But I think that there's more opportunity for people to kind of be themselves, and they're loosening up in some ways. So it's definitely changing. But yeah, and also the fact of the matter is, especially at the time, and I'm sure it still is to some degree, depending on where you lived in Japan, it would be a totally different world as well. Like when we first got there, we were west of Tokyo in a place called Karuizawa, which is kind of a resort town now. They have a lot of skiing and stuff like that, and there's a lot of people that go there. And then we were there for a year, and then we moved down south on Kyushu to a place called Kagoshima, and that was right across the bay from an incredibly active volcano called Sakurajima, which is decades ago it blew its top off and pretty much shook the world. But when we got there, we almost saw no other gaijin, foreigners. And by the way, gaijin is the short term for gaikokujin, and gaijin's not necessarily the most complimentary term, and we heard it over and over and over and over many, many times per day. So for anybody out there that's ever been a minority someplace, I totally know how you feel. I've been there, done that. But so when we went to Kagoshima, yeah, it was completely different, and we were really a minority, and it was a really interesting situation. There were negatives, but there were a lot of positives that we took away from it, and it was a great experience too.
What was the first, when you first got to Japan, what was maybe the first thing that hit you that said that you were in a completely different place?
Well, language and not being able to understand anybody, it hits you right away because your brain wants to find the pattern. What's going on? I need to understand this. And suddenly you're surrounded by people none of whom you can understand at all. You can't read anything. You know that if you get lost from your parents, you're hosed. And you don't know the airport. You don't know again, it hit me right off the plane. And the thing is that you just don't understand anything. And for anybody who's ever gone abroad, they know how much it tires your brain out. It just wears on you not being able to understand anything, be able to read anything, and try to understand what's going on. It's pretty dramatic to be dropped in the middle of that with nothing. And that was what hit me right away, was this is a whole different place, and I have no clue what's going on, and I don't even know how to start interpreting it.
Well, I assume being over there for 8 years, you eventually picked up, at least some of the language. Was it very hard to learn the language, or once you got going, did it seem to make sense to you?
It wasn't hard to learn enough to function and especially to understand other people. My spoken Japanese never was incredibly good, and my spoken Japanese, I should also say, was also immature. It was like a kid would use. So now, with the Japanese that I learned at that point in time, when I start talking to Japanese adults, I have to be very careful. And with the company that I work for, we have a lot of Japanese equipment vendors, who design and make equipment that we use, and they come over from Japan all the time. So occasionally I'll practice my Japanese with them, not very often. But yeah, so I learned enough to function as a kid there, yeah. But one thing I should say is that we didn't go to Japanese schools, because by the time I got there, there would have been no way. I mean, to catch up on all the Chinese characters that they learn, as well as the subjects, it would have been impossible. It would have taken years to get to the point where we could have understood the curriculum that would have been, in place when we first got there. You know what I mean? We would have been years behind. So we didn't do that. We had correspondence study that we did. So we were studying in English and studying stuff that we were given by, I think it came from University of Lincoln, Nebraska. They had junior high and high school and grade school correspondence courses, I think. Anyway, so yeah, we did get to function. Now my sister, she got to where she could speak Japanese pretty well. In fact, her accent was so good that if people spoke to her on the phone, they thought she was Japanese. They didn't know. I never got quite that good. My brother didn't get quite that good. My brother and sister both learned to read a little bit more of the kanji, which is the Japanese way of using the Chinese characters. There's three different I guess you call them alphabets. There's three different systems in Japan. There's kanji, there's katakana, and there's hiragana, and they kind of all mesh together, whereas the Chinese just use what the Japanese call the kanji, which is the Chinese characters. So it's different in that way. But I never learned a lot of the kanji, and it's something that I still haven't really learned as much to date as I would like to. I keep intending to go back and start making dedicated study of reading Japanese, but I haven't really done that yet.
Well, yeah, because their language is its symbols more. The symbols represent words.
Yeah, and they can represent. Yeah, exactly right. So you have one kanji, which is a Chinese character, and that one kanji can represent, a whole bunch of things. It's not just a letter like we would say. It's not like an alphabetic letter. It has a meaning, it has a sound, and it can have multiple meanings and sounds depending on the context that it's used in. So the same exact Chinese character can mean and sound and be used in different ways.
That's not confusing at all.
No, not at all. I can't imagine why everybody doesn't have that kind of system.
Yeah, and they go, like you say, they go from our, what we're used to with an alphabet, 26 letters arranged in different combination to form words. You actually have to literally learn basically a number of words and associate them with symbols, and then each one has multiple meanings. Now, and I suppose it's the context in which it's used determines what the meaning of that word is then.
Right. The context determines the meaning. Sometimes it doesn't necessarily determine the meaning, but it will definitely determine the way it sounds. Like it will sound like a completely different word. It might mean the same thing, it might not, and it depends on the context. So sometimes the same meaning is expressed with different actual spoken words, though the kanji character is the same. And then other times it's spoken different and it has a slightly different meaning depending on how it's used. So it's an interesting thing.
Yeah, that would be hard for a person to wrap their mind around. Now, the other thing, I'm assuming one of the first other things you noticed was the difference in the food when you got over there. Was that very hard to adjust to, or?
Yes and no. It was in a lot of ways. As time went on, it got a lot easier. Of course, I was a kid and I was used to American food, and some of the stuff that Japanese eat did not seem appealing to me at first. But one of the things that we did was at home we ate a mix of Japanese and American food. And of course, whenever we went out, we would eat Japanese food. We tried to be adventurous about it and really, get into it and eat the Japanese food. And then, of course, by the time we left, I loved Japanese food. There's not much Japanese food that I won't eat. It's pretty much all stuff that I love. And whenever I can, I try to find Japanese restaurants around here that are the most authentic possible, and they're owned by Japanese, and I'll go in and talk to them and say, we'll get talking to how I used to live in Kagoshima, and they'll get all excited, and sometimes they'll bring me their best food. Kind of works out pretty well.
Yeah, that would be kind of cool. Now, I mean, for somebody like me from the Midwest that's basically a beef eater, going over there, the seafood would be kind of hard for me to get used to.
It is, but it's not like American seafood. Like, I don't like American seafood that much. Oh, I'll eat it. I will eat fish and all that. I'm not a big shrimp or crab or lobster guy. So I'm not a huge American seafood person, but the Japanese yeah, it's all seafood, but it's completely different. It tastes different. It looks different. It smells different. It's a different experience for. So it to me, it's like a whole different thing. If you like seafood in America, you may not like it in Japan. If you like it in Japan, you may not like it in America, and all that. So it's not. I don't equate the two.
Okay. Well, you said the second place you went to, you kind of felt a little bit more like kind of like an outsider, or you know, maybe not necessarily fitting in. Overall, though, did the Japanese people seem to accept you after a while, or
It was a mix. It was a mixture. People who didn't know us, we were definitely outsiders, and we would get followed around by kids a lot, yelling "gaijin" and throwing rocks and stuff like that. Um, then, of course, there were adults who really didn't want to get involved with us at all, and they would kind of look down their nose at us. And then there were a lot of people who were just totally delightful. A lot of people that we met, adult people, would be very friendly to us, and then we would, we had friends there that we would get to be friends with, and they would be nice to us as well. It was a little harder with the kids, I found. More of the adults were accepting and friendly, although there were certainly those who were not. But it was a thing where it was a mixture, and it never changed. It never really changed that much. We had people that we were great friends with and treated us, pretty much like equals. Not just equals in terms of status, but equals in terms of culture. They didn't care about the culture difference. They didn't care that we were Americans and all that, which is a big thing in Japan. They are really homogenous, and even though if you're different than them, even though you've known them for a long time, they're still thinking about those differences in their minds. I guarantee it. And we ran into that a lot. But we had many, many friends who we seemed to get past that barrier with. But from the time we got there to the time we left, those 8 years, it never really the difference never really changed. There were always people with it was very difficult, and always people that it was really fun and interesting to interact with.
When you spend time in a culture like that, eventually you start to absorb some of their traits and characteristics. Was there any particular thing that kind of left a lasting impression on you, as far as their kind of their beliefs or the way that they live?
When we came back to America, I thought Americans are loud, they're obnoxious, they're very selfish and self-centered. It just hit me, the difference between the two cultures. I couldn't stand it for a long time. The other thing was, of course, for the reason that we went over there, we were involved with Japanese churches. And in Japan, I'm not sure what it's like now, but I suspect it's still largely the same. But in Japan, when people decide they want to become Christians and believe in the Bible and believe in God, they pretty much lose their families. Because what they're saying is, I'm not going to pray to my ancestors. I'm not going to do certain things that you feel are necessary when you die, that I have to take care of you. I don't believe in that anymore. And so their families are like, you're out of here. You're not part of our family anymore. So for them to decide they want to take on these beliefs, they have to give something up. It has to mean something. They can't just go to church on Sunday and then go home and there's no difference. There's no penalty to pay. So that was another thing that I noticed right away was, coming back, seeing the American churches and seeing how many people it didn't seem to have any effect on their lives whatsoever.
So it would be obvious to state then that there was resistance to preaching the gospel over there. Then it wasn't just an easy sell.
No, not at all. Not an easy sell. And even people who came to believe it and wanted to believe it, a lot of those people refused to become Christians because they knew the price they would have to pay, and they weren't willing to pay it. It would mean their career. I mean, it would really mean their career for a lot of those people. They were not going to have a career. It would mean their families. It would mean a lot of things that just looked insurmountable and impossible. And you run the gamut of people who just think you're insane and don't want to have anything to do with it, which is fine. You get that here too. And then you get the people who do respond, but they're not willing to pay that price. They just can't do it. And a lot of it's because of, not for selfishness per se, but because they're so oriented towards their family and the responsibilities that they have, they just could not bring themselves to throw those responsibilities away and throw that in their families' faces.
So basically they'd be kind of culturally ostracized then from the rest of society.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so that would, if you're going to make that commitment, you're really going to have to make that commitment and take it seriously then.
Yeah, you're for real. There's no Sunday, Christian and then go home and go out drinking and swearing with the buddies on Monday or whatever. It's not that way. It's when you do this, you better mean it, and yeah, it's got to mean something. And oh, by the way, you're going to pay a heavy price. Hope that's all right.
Yeah, I guess that's something that we don't always think about in this country, is that we do have, the freedom to, take whatever religion we want without really, being any real consequences. And I guess some of us don't think about how much it does mean in other cultures to make that sort of commitment.
Yeah, here, some people are going to say we're crazy. I mean, right now, there's a lot. To me, it seems like there's a strong current of, if you believe in a God, you're labeled insane because it's unscientific. I mean, that sentiment is pretty strong, but it's only words. Who cares? You can still have your job. You're not. It's just like any other belief system that you agree with or disagree with. I'm a Republican. Oh, well, the Democrats hate you. Well, who cares? Well, it's like that. I'm a Democrat. The Republicans hate me. Who cares? It's like that. It's not of any more serious magnitude than that in terms of impact on your life. It's just people talking, and who cares? You can quit listening to them anytime you want to. Whereas there, it is your life.
Yeah. Here it's words. Yeah, and like you say, there it's more than that. It's emotional. It's family. There is a price to pay.
Yeah. So that's one of the things that hit me big time when I came back to the United States was, these people aren't for real. And yet, it's not that they weren't, but that's how it struck me. That was what immediately struck me, was these people aren't for real. They don't know what they're talking about. And again, with the cultural things of Americans are loud, they're boisterous. And we would see that all the time when we would see Americans in Japan. They'd be yelling and talking, and you're all crammed together on a train, and the Japanese were just kind of looking down at their feet like, how can these people behave like this? And, when you live in a tiny little country like Japan and you're packed in like sardines, you have to adopt certain cultural behaviors. And one of those is, don't be so loud, and don't be, the way that Western cultures like to behave. That is a massive difference.
Was there any part of their culture that really just kind of resonated with you, that you just you thought was really cool, or that you thought that you kind of wanted to embrace?
Well, of course, as a kid, I watched a lot of TV, and I liked the Japanese cartoons and the robots and the types of heroes they had on TV. I always got into that big time. Also in Japan, not so many cars compared to, here everybody owns a car. It's not that way in Japan. There's no room to park them, for one thing. There's no room to drive them. It's a lot of public transportation, which I got used to. That was another thing. When we came back here, I'm like, you got to be kidding me. These people have no infrastructure. What a bunch of heathens. Well, of course, America's a lot bigger. Implementing that would be harder. But, that was a difference that struck me. So we had excellent infrastructure. As a kid, we could hop on the bus and go downtown all day without our parents, and nobody would care. A lot safer there. Once in a while, a child would disappear, and then they would catch the person who did it, and they would go away for the rest of their life. But that kind of thing didn't happen very often. It was very, very safe. So there was that, and there was the fact that bicycles and motorcycles were huge down there. Everybody had a bicycle, and there was tons of motorcycles. And as a boy, I really learned to love motorcycles while we were in Japan. So I'd say the TV, I liked their TV, I liked their motorcycles, bicycles, and I liked the fact that I could go anywhere as a kid in Japan without my parents and feel perfectly safe at all times.
Yeah, you mentioned the transportation. That kind of something I thought about. Last year we took a family vacation to Minneapolis. And growing up here in South Dakota, you just basically, anywhere you want to go, you jump in the car and you drive somewhere because it's a distance to go anywhere. Once we got there, we decided that we would take some public transportation because we didn't want to, the country hicks didn't want to be driving in the big city like that. So we took the bus and the train and used public transportation. That was a new experience for, all of us, because we've never really, done that. And so to be in a country where you kind of have to plan your travel according to the transit would be kind of a different way for us in this country to think about things.
Yeah, and the thing is, think of it, though, as the transit's completely different. Like, the buses are everywhere. There's a bus stop everywhere. The buses come every so often. It's not like you're going to wait forever. They're on time. The trains are on time. I read something someone posted recently about, when you're in Japan and they say the train's going to arrive in the station at a certain time, you can look at your watch and start walking out the door, and it will open right at that time. It's just it's like clockwork. And their transportation system is excellent. It's everywhere. You never have to wait, and it's just so. Thinking of transportation here in the United States and public transportation systems, even in places that have very good ones, it's still quite a bit different than what I think of as the public transportation system in Japan.
Hmm. And you mentioned too that you felt safe there. So now was that because there was police everywhere, or was it their culture that itself kind of frowned upon unlawful behavior?
A lot less violent crimes. I mean, there are violent crimes, and of course, I've read a lot of interesting books by people like Jake Adelstein, who was an American who went and became a reporter for a Japanese newspaper over there, and he covered the crime beat. So yeah, there's definitely a seedy side of Japanese life, but for the most part, especially at the time we were there, it was very, very safe. I mean, my sister, who was also, who was a young girl at that time, also about my age, we're about 1 year apart, and she would go downtown by herself, and she would be safe. Now, it was different for her because, blonde-haired girl, blue eyes, and being a gaijin, and it was a little bit different for her, and I'm not going to say that a lot of Japanese men don't find that intriguing. However, it was still safe enough for her to do those things and not worry about it. It was just a different thing. You didn't have kids disappearing like they do here. You didn't have the types of murders and kidnapping like you do here. They did happen, not anywhere near as frequent, or, it was kind of unusual when you heard about it. It was a big deal when something happened to a child.
Now, have you been back to Japan since you were over there?
No, I haven't been back to Japan, and I would love to go back to Japan. The main reason is expense, of course, and then just timing, other responsibilities. But I do work in a company where, like I said, we have a lot of Japanese people come over and working for the Japanese companies, and they come over and we get to deal with them a lot. And I've had a lot of interaction with some of the people, and I have a sense that either Japan is definitely changing and they're loosening up in a lot of regards, and the kind of cultural barriers between Americans and Japanese are really lightening up, or the people that I meet just happen to be the people that are most comfortable with us because they're the people that speak English the best and they're the personalities that get along with us the best, so they're the guys that get shipped over here to deal with us. I don't think that's necessarily it. I think that might be part of it, but I don't think that's just it, because some of these guys are experts in a particular thing, and that's why they're over here. So it feels to me like a lot of change is taking place. And yeah, I would definitely like to go back. I'd love to go back to Kagoshima, go up to this park called Yoshino Park and stare across the bay at that active volcano Sakurajima again, like I used to as I was a kid. That would be a dream of a lifetime come true.
Well, yeah, I would find it kind of interesting to just go over to, because I assume part of their culture is new, but I'm sure that there are parts of the country that are just like, centuries old, and just to see, that kind of history and that kind of, atmosphere, I think would just be fascinating.
Yeah, and that's the thing about Japan is it's small, so you can get to places like that pretty easily. And there were so many times we would go to places that were in the Japanese country, in little villages and all that, and they would have the public onsen, which is the public baths that you would go into, and you could take your bath and you could interact with the Japanese the way they lived, and then you could have real authentic Japanese food. Really authentic Japanese food, and interact with people who'd never seen a foreigner before, and it was very interesting. I mean, I would think it would be like going to some jungle and meeting a tribe that had really never dealt with outsiders before. It was along those lines of interest and kind of amusement on both sides, and a lot of fun. Yeah, you can definitely do that in Japan.
Yeah, it sounds like that would be a good place to go. Do you have any kind of closing comments you kind of want to say about your experiences in Japan?
The one thing that Japan taught me was it's okay to be different. It's okay to, and by that I mean not necessarily just it's okay for that I was different in Japan. What I mean is learn another language as different from English as possible if you can, because it teaches you a totally different way of thinking. Your brain will work differently. Different wires will be, connecting in your brain. Learn a different culture. Learn how to, because the thing about it is that, I found this with a lot of the people that I went to high school with once we came back, that I went to my senior year of high school with when we came back. They associate so many things that I don't associate. For example, people here associate, if you go to church and you have these beliefs, you also have to be a Republican and you have to believe, well, when I was in Japan, those people were definitely giving up their entire lives to believe, and yet there was no talk of Republican or Democrat or anything else. Who cares? It didn't matter. I saw things that weren't connected that here in the United States we connect that I don't think need to be connected. And it's just eye-opening. I think everybody, if possible, should experience it to some degree, and they should certainly try to get their kids to experience it to some degree. It just reminds you that some of the things that are held so sacred in one place, you find that life is perfectly okay without in other places, and it changes your mind about certain types of dogma. And it's just a lot of fun to meet people who are totally different than you and who are interested in you and them as well.
Yeah, that would, change a person's perspective, I guess. But, I guess at this point we'll kind of wrap this up. And, I thank you for coming and talking to me and, and kind of, just giving us a different view than what we're normally used to.
Yeah, and I want to tell you, I'm enjoying your show a lot. I've listened to both of the other episodes. I feel like you have so many more stories and so many unexplored angles of your own story that I can't wait to hear. And also, I was kind of fascinated by the tattoo artist in your town. That was an interesting story. It seems like a very unlikely one, but it's pretty interesting. I mean, not unlikely in saying that I don't believe it, but it's just kind of interesting that he came to be in that place.
Well, yeah, and like I kind of mentioned in my last episode, I'm kind of looking for, I'm trying to look at the way I was raised and look at different things. That's why I found that what you were saying interesting, because this is a small town, and it's not that we're all exactly the same, but we're all kind of like variations of the same note. So that to go out and look at other cultures and see what things are different. It just does kind of fascinate me to see other people's view of the world. And that's what I want to try and bring to this podcast.
Yeah, and if you don't mind my extending it for another couple minutes here.
Sure.
It reminds me of my granddad. My granddad was a farmer in eastern Washington, Colfax. And tough as nails, old boy, wouldn't take anything from anybody. And he was a get-it-done kind of guy. One of the greatest examples of what I consider a manly man, a men's man. And he, of course, hated the Japanese because of the war. Very hateful towards the Japanese. Well, when we came back from our first 4-year stint over there, my brother brought his best friend Koji. They had done karate together in Japan. They had done all kinds of things together in Japan, and they were great friends. Koji came over and went to my granddad's farm and stayed on the farm with us for at least a week, I'm pretty sure. And my granddad grew to respect that guy so much. He just had nothing but respect for him. And he wouldn't admit it, but it really opened his eyes to the fact that these are also human beings, and I cannot hate an entire cultural race based on the acts of some of their representatives. And that, to me, that was a really fascinating experience because I'm sure you know his type, old farm boy, very set in his ways, hamburger and applesauce every day and nothing else. And here comes this Japanese guy who he thought he would hate, and he really learned to respect him.
Well, yeah, and actually that was kind of one of my inspirations for this was, I've talked about my dad telling stories, but my mom also told stories. And she, when she was a teenager during the 30s, there wasn't any work here in South Dakota, so she went to Michigan to work for people. And she ended up being the equivalent of what would be an au pair today, working for Jewish families in Michigan there. And we were raised what I call German Lutheran here, the strict conservative type of thinking, and part of our religious education was how the Jews treated Jesus. Well, and then also being half German, I've never really embraced my German side because I was born in '62, 20 years after World War II was ended, but still, what the Germans did to the Jews was still, still fresh in society's mind. And so I was always, I wouldn't say embarrassed by being part German, but it was never really, the side of me that I really wanted to embrace. So I always considered myself more of the Scotch-Irish, and it's only been the last few years that I've been able to, like I say, kind of embrace my German side once I kind of realized, I know I'm working with stereotypes, but that my kind of analytical thinking side probably came from the Germans. But just listening to my mom tell stories about working for these Jewish people and just the difference in their culture, some of the stories I remember her telling was that during their religious holidays they would eat unleavened bread, and so she would have to keep her bread in the pantry or in some outbuilding away from the house during their religious times, so that they would not become unclean, and it was different and not what we were the way we were raised, but she respected these people, and her telling me these stories, as people experiencing these things, it taught me that even though you may not necessarily agree with other people's viewpoints, you should still respect them, because they are human beings just the same as the rest of us.
Right. Yep. Absolutely.
So, but again, I thank you for coming on, and this has been a very entertaining experience.
Well, thank you, Mike. I appreciate it too. And like I said, I'm really enjoying the podcast. Can't guarantee that this one will be up to the level of the other two that you've done, but I'm a listener, and anybody who's happened to be listening but not subscribed, I would recommend it. Mike's a great storyteller, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of great stuff to come.
I named this episode Domo Arigato. I like titles that work on several different levels, and this one certainly does that. Now, most people will think of this as the chorus from the song by Styx called Mr. Roboto, but actually in Japanese it means thank you very much, and I do have much to be thankful for here. I would like to thank Scott for coming on and talking about his experiences growing up in Japan. And I'd also like to thank Julie Keel, my fellow co-host along with Jeff Sire on the Sci-Fi Tech Talk podcast, for doing the intro and outro sections for my podcast. It adds a touch of class that makes it seem a whole lot better. I would like to also thank my other fellow podcasters and people on Twitter for all the support I received for this podcast. For being somebody new to the game and just coming kind of out of nowhere, I'm surprised at the amount of support and encouragement I have received from people. It really kind of warms my heart to know that people will take someone under the wing and help them like that. So I guess the most appropriate way to end this would be to say sayonara and hope to see you next time.
If you have a story you'd like to tell, contact Mike on Twitter at BardOnThePlains or by email at bardontheplains@gmail.com. For more information about the stories in this podcast, visit bardontheplains.com.